Ego is the pseudo-self. Ego is the pathological adjustment that is demanded by society. So you'll never in your life hear more garbage spoken about any subject than you will hear about the nature of the ego and the self. This is where it all goes wrong. And one has to spend a lifetime extrapolating it. Now, people like Ayn Rand, and as her protege, Nathaniel Branden wrote, I think at least books, 5, 6 books on cultivating, he called it self-esteem, but it's really self-love. She spoke about it, many others have. And it does ring off bells because we are highly collectivized, just like I said at the very beginning of the interview here, that
right.
It's a desperate situation, and nothing will change in the individual until they start to see something that's wrong, because they've got to analyze their own life, which requires a certain amount of introspection, a certain amount of self-reflection. This is the boon of being self-conscious beings. We can do that. Animals can't change their psychological behavior. We can. And you do that by trial and error. So the short answer to that question is simply this. Life is nothing but a process of trial and error. But what we fail to realize is that we could not discern error, especially when we meet it really in big terms, some major errors. We kind of are told by a quiet, silent voice within, the still small voice within, that knows when we're going wrong. And that's the voice of conscience. Now, it's actually not too far away from this devil card, actually, because one of the figures in the card in the foreground actually represents this spirit of the conscience, but we'll leave that for a few minutes. All right, so we have a more originary understanding, deep set understanding of what is truly right and wrong, that transcends the public, that transcends society, that transcends the parents' impositions and expectations, right? And that is what Schelling and these people were talking about. It's not the ego, it's not the super ego, it's not the ego ideal, it is conscience. And that conscience is really synonymous with the self, the true self. So, but you're never going to get a person to shift into seeking for that, because as we said at the beginning, it's incredibly arduous. The moment that the person sets out to cultivate self-love, that's when the problems begin. That's why those 2 darker cards immediately follow this beautiful card, because no sooner, in other words, the person who's remaining just on a sort of a low setting of self-consciousness, he's conscious, you're sure he's conscious, but they're never self-conscious enough to analyze themselves, to ask the big questions of life. Well, who am I? What am I doing here? How much role do I have to control my own fate, etc. When people are just conscious moving around and using the flow of the crowd to keep them up, then they get along to go on. That's the essence of the master-slave relationship that we spoke about in the program. Those chains around the neck of 2 figures can easily be removed by their own hands. Why did they not do it? Because in the slavery, there's security, right? And the master is, in his own way, enslaved by this dynamic, but that's on a more subtle level. Basically, the weak soul, the conscious person, or the person who's only got a very low self-conscious setting, wants to remain in those chains. And so he does not want to awaken the self. And so these 2 cards represent then, the nadir, the son, the solar child, or the fool in a state of, real moribund collectivity. And he's quite content with the master-slave relationship because of the securities that they get there. And what that really means, to answer your question, is that we will remain as a pseudo-self. Now, here's a weird thing. Sometimes I get emails from people going, Michael, I don't know, I'm confused. I've heard you say on certain interviews that you have said, maybe it's in even more explicitly, and say something like psychic vampirism, but I've said it across the board. And that is that we should never be enlightenment constitutes not being negatively affected by what other people say, think, or do. And on paper, that sounds really easy and fine. But of course, it's impossible. How can you not be moved by what people say, think, and do? We're constantly moved by that. So some people say it doesn't make sense. And then other people who hit me back on that and said, well, wait a minute, isn't that what a psychopath is like? They don't care what other people think, say, and do. So I don't get what you're talking about. You're obviously not meaning I should be a psychopath and cut off all my money. So what do you mean by this radical statement? And I have said it on purpose to immediately do this exact thing, to incite that type of thinking, that type of argument. Because you see, the spiritual man, the really spiritual man, is very similar to a psychopath. He's not one, but they share many similar traits. And so this is where the journey towards enlightenment becomes very peculiar, very odd, because there's actually a certain symbiosis, when you see it from one perspective. And that's why you have to really, really dissect it and find out what on earth. If Michael Tsarion is saying that the spiritual man, the Taoist, the authentic man, the Howard Rourke, he's not swayed by what other people say, think, and do. He listens to it and he's swayed, but he's not negatively swayed. He's not thrown off his kilter. He's not made lesser. He doesn't lose his own authenticity. That sounds very nice. And maybe he's right. Maybe those are the attributes of the spiritual enlightened man. But I know when I study psychopaths that they don't seem to care what other people think, say, and do. So this can cause a major problem. And as I said, I've had into email debates on people like, and it's very appropriate to what we're talking about now. And what I say to people in the emails and stuff is simple. And that is, look, you misunderstand. The psychopathic personality type does care what other people think, say, and do to a pathological degree. When you meet them as a psychopath, you're meeting them, at the end of a long process. They didn't just pop out like that. In the beginning, these Jeffrey Dahmers or whoever it might have been, they were, well, maybe never completely normal, but that's another conversation. But what happened was, yes, they were pathologically brought up to be hyper interested in what mom and dad and neighbors and uncles and aunts and school friends and teachers. They met this world that had so many demands on them that they couldn't meet the demand, so to speak. And so they met the collective head on, and they did exactly what you're meant to do, which is do anything to get that approval. Be anyone, act like anyone, and carry on doing that. But then a certain point came in their puberty where this reached a critical mass, and whereas every other individual is able to, swim in the plasma and just get used to it. They have deep frustrations and they have horrible fantasies, just like the psychopath, but in some way it hasn't reached fever point, and they're able to go about in their suits and ties, these stuffed shirts, and carry on, doing what they're doing with an apparent ubiquitousness. And unless you're an extremely sensitive person, you would not see behind their mask and feel, their reeking energy. When they're serving you behind the counter, or you're working at the next cubicle to this person, or, if you're sensitive, you won't be able to stand it because you'll sense that something is deeply wrong with the people around you. And I mean lots of people. But to all intents and purposes, they're not psychopathic. It hasn't reached that level. It's just below the surface, and so on. The psychopath is a minority in our culture, but they're the ones who went, Jesus, no, there's an explosion. And then the psyche is in pieces because they've adopted the pseudo-self, the mask. But where do you think the rebellion came from? It came from the authentic self that's screaming to get out. The spiritual man, then, he's the one that when the authentic self starts screaming and they feel this, what I call, the legitimate suffering, is what the existentialist psychologists call it. He then goes and becomes a sannyasi. He becomes an outcast. He becomes the outsider, and he seeks the spiritual road. He has experienced the same meltdown as the psychopath, but the psychopath now tries to replace the mask. Instead of going towards the spiritual, to the mystical, or to a different type of life, a deeper sense of truth unto himself, he tries to put back the mask. But when he does it now in an even more imperfect way than he did when he was a child. It's hopeless, it's a mess. And he starts to realize that he can operate behind the mask, but he tries to be what he thinks is himself behind the mask, you see? It's like, a real mask. I can put this on and smile and get what I want. And he becomes sort of psychopathic. But there's even a deeper disconnect in him. Because what has now happened is, in order to put the mask back on and to fit into that society, what has happened? He, in one way, has had to crush the voice of his self even more than the person who went through this in phase one. He has had it crash. He's gone through a catharsis. But instead of going to the positive, instead of reacting positively to the catharsis, becoming an authentic being, he's become an inauthentic being, Mark II. But the Mark II psychopath now, he has got to really suppress. He's got to put even more no-nos in the way of that voice of conscience. You see, things like this are happening. And so now he's completely crushed his imperial self, much more than even, say, a normal person. So he is now playing the game of the superego. He's playing the game of the ego. He's playing the game of the pseudo-self, which answers your question, right? That he is responding on one level to the collective, very much so. So it's not a true not caring about what other people think, say, and do. He has become a narcissist, but his narcissism, when you dig down to find out what the root of it is, where's the battery? What is it, what's written at the base of this narcissism? It is deep, deep pathological interest in what the world was demanding of you. And therefore, it's more of a reaction. Now, the holistic aspect, as we've already described, is very, very different. That's very, very different. That is when you are not readjusting the mask, not reimposing the tyrant, but you're giving room for the self-love and the selfhood to come forth against the odds. And people can understand that this is very, very difficult. Very, very difficult. So it's actually easier to become psychopathic, and that's what our culture is doing. It's choosing to become more debauched, more narcissistic by the day, and it's less and less interested in that which is pointing it in the direction of self-love and of mastery and selfhood. And so Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Branden and anyone else who is an advocate, very few of these people today, but anyone who's focused on that, as I myself am, nobody's listening.